Tale of Genji, Chapter 1. Kiritsubo. At the court of an emperor, he lived it matters not when. There was among the many gentlewomen of the wardrobe and chamber one, who, though she was not of very high rank, was favored far beyond all the rest, so that the great ladies of the palace, each of whom had secretly hoped that she herself would be chosen, looked with scorn and hatred upon the upstart who had bespelled their dreams. Still less were her former companions, the minor ladies of the wardrobe, content to see her raised so far above them. Thus her position at court, preponderant though it was, exposed her to constant jealousy and ill will, and soon, worn out with petty vexations, she fell into a decline, growing very melancholy, and retiring frequently to her home. But the emperor, so far from wearying of her now that she was no longer well or gay, grew every day more tender, and paid not the smallest heed to those who reproved him, till his conduct became the talk of all the land, and even his own barons and courtiers began to look askance at an attachment so ill-advised. They whispered among themselves that in the land beyond the sea such happenings had led to riot and disaster. The people of the country did indeed soon have many grievances to show, and some likened her to Yang Kufi, the mistress of Minghyong. Yet for all this discontent, so great was the sheltering power of her master's love, that none dared openly molest her. Her father, who had been a counselor, was dead. Her mother, who never forgot that the father was in his day a man of some consequence, managed, despite all difficulties, to give her as good an upbringing as generally falls on the lot of young ladies whose parents are alive and at the height of fortune. It would have helped matters greatly if there had been some influential guardian to busy himself on the child's behalf. Unfortunately, the mother was entirely alone in the world, and sometimes when troubles came, she felt very bitterly the lack of anyone to whom she could turn for comfort and advice. But to return to the daughter, in due time she bore him a little prince, who, perhaps because in some previous life a close bond had joined them, turned out as fine and likely a man-child as well might be in all the land. The emperor could hardly contain himself during the days of waiting, but when at the earliest possible moment the child was presented at court, he saw that rumor had not exaggerated its beauty. The eldest-born prince was the son of Lady Kokiden, the daughter of the Minister of the Right, and this child was treated by all with the respect due to an undoubted heir apparent. But he was not so fine a child as this new prince. Moreover, the emperor's great affection for the new child's mother made him feel the boy to be in a peculiar sense his own possession. Unfortunately, she was not of the same rank as the courtiers who waited upon him in the upper palace, so that despite his love for her, and though she wore all the airs of a great lady, it was not without considerable qualms that he now made it his practice to have her by him not only when there was to be some entertainment, but even when any business of importance was afoot. Sometimes, indeed, he would keep her when he woke in the morning, not letting her go back to her lodging, so that willy-nilly she acted the part of a lady in perpetual attendance. Seeing all this, Lady Kokiden began to fear that the new prince, for whom the emperor seemed to have so marked a preference, would, if she did not take care, soon be promoted to the Eastern Palace. But she had, after all, priority over her rival. The emperor had loved her devotedly, and she had borne him princes. It was even now chiefly the fear of her reproaches that made him uneasy about his new way of life. Thus, though his mistress could be sure of his protection, there were many who sought to humiliate her, and she felt so weak in herself that it seemed to her at last as though all the honors heaped upon her had brought with them terror rather than joy. Her lodging was in the wing called Kiritsubo. It was but natural that the many ladies whose doors she had to pass on her repeated journeys to the emperor's room should have grown exasperated, and sometimes, when these comings and goings became frequent beyond measure, it would happen that on bridges and in corridors, here or there along the way that she must go, strange tricks were played to frighten her, or else pleasant things were left lying about, which spoiled the dresses of the ladies who accompanied her. Once, indeed, someone locked the door of a portico, so the poor thing wandered this way and that for a great while in some distress. So many were the mysteries in which the states of affairs now daily brought her that the emperor could no longer endure to witness her vexations, and moved her to the Koroden. In order to make room for her, he was obliged to shift the chief lady of the wardrobe to lodgings outside. So far from improving matters, he had merely procured her in a new and more embittered enemy. The young prince was now 3 years old. The putting on of the trousers was performed with as much ceremony as in the case of the heir apparent. Marvelous gifts flowed from the imperial treasury and the tribute house. This too incurred the censure of many, but brought no enmity to the child himself, for his growing beauty and the charm of his disposition were a wonder and a delight to all who met him. Indeed, many persons of ripe experience confessed themselves astounded that such a creature should actually have been born in these latter and degenerate days. In the summer of that year the lady became very downcast, and she repeatedly asked for leave to go to her home, but it was not granted. For a year she continued in the same state. The emperor, to all her entreaties, answered only, "Try for a little while longer." But she was getting worse every day, and when for 5 or 6 days she had been growing steadily weaker, her mother sent to the palace a tearful plea for her release. Fearing even now that her enemies might contrive to put some unimaginable shame upon her, the sick lady left her son behind and prepared to quit the palace in secret. The emperor knew that the time had come when, little as he liked it, he must let her go, but that she should slip away without a word of farewell was more than he could bear, and he hastened to her side. He found her still charming and quite beautiful, but her face was very thin and wan. She looked at him tenderly, saying nothing. Was she alive? So faint was the dwindling spark that she scarcely seemed so. Suddenly forgetting all that had happened and all that was to come, he called her by 100 pretty names, and weeping showed upon her 1,000 caresses. But she made no answer. For sounds and sights reached her but faintly, and she seemed dazed, as one that scarcely remembered that she lay upon a bed. Seeing her thus, he knew not what to do, and in great trouble and perplexity he sent for a hand-litter. And when they would have laid her in it, he forbade them, saying, "There was an oath between us that neither should go alone upon the road that all at last must tread. How can I now let her go from me?" The lady heard him and said, "At last," she said, "though that desired at last become, because I go alone, how gladly would I live." Thus, with faint voice and failing breath, she whispered, but though she had found enough to speak, each word was uttered with great toil and great pain. Come what might, the emperor would have watched by her till the end, but that the priests who were to read the intercenses had already been dispatched to her home. She must be brought there before nightfall, and at last he forced himself to let the bearers carry her away. He tried to sleep, but felt stifled and could not close his eyes. All night long messengers were coming and going between her home and the palace. From first they brought no good news, and soon after midnight announced that this time, on arriving at the house, they had heard a noise of wailing and lament, and learned from those within that the lady had just breathed her last. The emperor lay motionless, as though he had not understood. Though his father was so fond of his company, it was thought better that this event that the prince should go away from the palace. He did not understand what had happened, but seeing the servants all wringing their hands, and the emperor himself continually weeping, he felt that it must have been something quite terrible. He knew that even quite ordinary separations made people unhappy, And here was such a dismal wailing and lamenting as he had never seen before. But he concluded that this must be some very extraordinary kind of parting. When the time came for the funeral to begin, the girl's mother cried out that the smoke of her own body would be seen rising beside the smoke of her child's bier. She rode in the same coach with the court ladies who had come to the funeral. The ceremony took place at Atago and was celebrated with quite splendor. So overpowering was the mother's affection that so long as she looked on the body, she still thought of her child as alive. It was only when they lighted the pyre that she suddenly realized that what lay upon it was a corpse. Then, though she tried to speak sensibly, she reeled and almost fell from the couch. And those with her turned to one another and said, "Ah, at last she knows." A herald came from the palace and read a proclamation which promoted the dead lady to the third rank. The reading of this long proclamation by the bearer was a sad business. The emperor repented bitterly that he had not long ago made her a lady-in-waiting, and that was why he now raised her rank by a single degree. There were many who grudged her even this honor, but some less stubborn began now to recall that she had indeed been a lady of uncommon beauty, and others that she had very gentle and pleasing manners, while some went so far as to say it was a shame that anybody should have disliked so sweet a lady, and that if she had not been singled out unfairly from the rest, no one would have said a word against her. The 7 weeks of mourning were, by the emperor's order, minutely observed. Time passed, but he still lived in rigid seclusion from the ladies of the court. The servants who waited upon him had a sad life, for he wept almost without ceasing both day and night. Kokiden and other great ladies were still relentless, and went about saying it looked as though the emperor would be no less foolishly obsessed by her memory than he had been by her person. He did indeed sometimes see Kokuden's son, the firstborn prince, but this only made him long the more to see the dead lady's child, and he was always sending trusted servants, such as his own old nurse, to report to him upon the boy's progress. The time of the autumn equinox had come. Already the touch of the evening air was cold upon the skin. So many memories crowded upon him that he sent a girl, the daughter of his quiver-bearer, with a letter to the dead lady's house. It was beautiful moonlit weather, and after he had dispatched the messenger, he lingered for a while, gazing out into the night. It was at such times as this that he had been wont to call for music. He remembered how her words, lightly whispered, had blended with those strangely fashioned harmonies, remembered how all was strange, her face, her air, her forms. He thought of the poem, which says that real things in the darkness seem no realer than dreams, and he longed for even so dim a substance as the dream life of those once nights. The messenger had reached the gates of the house, and she pushed them aback, and a strange sight met her eyes. The old lady had for long been a widow, and the whole charge of keeping the domain in repair had fallen upon her. But since her death, the mother, sank in age and despair, had done nothing to the place, and everywhere the weeds grew high, and to all this desolation was added the wildness of the autumn gale. Great clumps of mugwort grew so thick that only the moonlight could penetrate them. The messengers alighted at the entrance of the house. At first the mother could find no words with which to greet her, and soon she said, "Alas, I have lingered too long in the void. I cannot bear to think that though so fine a messenger as you have pressed your way through the dewy thickets that bar the road to my house." And she burst into uncontrollable weeping. Then the quiver-bearer's daughter said, "One of the palace maids who came here told his majesty that her heart had been torn with pity at what she saw, and I, madame, am in like case." Then after a little hesitation, she repeated the emperor's message. For a while I scratched in the darkness of my mind, groping for an exit from my dreams, but after long pondering, I can find no way to wake. There is none here to console me. Will you not come to me secretly? It is not well that the young prince should spend his days in so desolate and sad a place. Let him come too. This he said, and much else, but confusedly and with many sighs, and I, seeing that the struggle to hide his grief from me was casting him dear, hurried away from the palace without hearing all. But here is the letter that he sent. Oh, my sight is dim, said the mother. Let me hold his letter to the light. The letter spoke. I had thought that after a while there might be some blurring, some slight effacement, but no. As days and months go by, the more senseless, the more endurable becomes my life. I am continually thinking of the child, wondering how he fares. I had hoped that his mother and I together would watch over his upbringing. Will you not take her place in this, and bring him to me as a memory of the past? Such was the letter, and many instructions were added to it together with a poem which said, At the sound of the wind that binds the cold dew on Takagi Moor, my heart goes out to tender like streams. It was of the young prince that he spoke in symbol, but she did not read the letter to the end. At last the mother said, Though I know that long life means only bitterness, I have stayed so long in the world that even before the pine tree of Takaso, I have to hide my head in shame. How then should I then find courage to go hither and thither in the great palace of 100 towers? Though the august summons should call me time and again, myself I could not obey, but the young prince, whether he may have heard the august wish I know not, is impatient to return, and what is small wonder, seems very downcast in this place. Tell his majesty this, and whatever else of my thoughts you have were learned from me. For a little child, this house is indeed a very sorry place. They say that the child is asleep. The quiver-bearer's daughter answered, I should like to have seen him, and told the emperor how he looks, but I am awaited at the palace, and it must be late. She then hastened away, but the mother, since even those who wander in the darkness of their own black thoughts can gain by converse a momentary beam to guide their steps, I pray you sometime to visit me of your own accord, and when you are at leisure. In years past it was a time of joy and triumph that you come to the house, and now this is the news you bring. Foolish are they indeed who trust to fortune. From the time she was born until her death, her father, who knew she was his own mind, would have it that they should go to the court, and charged me again and again not to disappoint his wishes if he were to die. And so, though I thought that the lack of guardian would bring her into many difficulties, I was determined to carry out his desires. At court she found that favors only too great were to be hers, and all the while must needs endure in secrecy the tokens of inhuman malice, till hatred had heaped upon her so heavy a load of cares that she died, as it were murdered. Indeed, the love that in his wisdom he designed to show her, or so sometimes it seems to me, in the uncomprehending darkness of my heart, was crueler than simple indifference.